of, I don't even have a mixed metaphor for what it is, trying to get the any kind of data out of the VR platforms that we work with. But our count was that we had 170 speaker virtual platform, been classified as the largest virtual conference on record, immersive virtual. There's been bigger ones that are virtual, but this is the largest immersive virtual. And so we're getting requests and demands constantly and now which is lovely, not what we want to be doing, but it's what we're doing, because we have bigger picture of things that we want to be doing, asking us how to do a virtual conference. And so, Karen, thank you, Karen. Yes, I'm a robot. Hold on a second. Let me change clothes. I forgot. I call this my InfoZone armor. Thank you. Okay. Now I look like me. The joys of VR. We can change who we are all the time in just a few clicks. Sorry about that. I hope nobody was looking while I changed clothes. Okay. So.
Yeah, but we liked
it. Yay. So we have had at least 6,000 attendees. What that means is that the total number of people who actually attended at an event was around 1,000 people who came into AltSpace and into Engage and into Rumi and Somnium Space and Mozilla Hub. So that was an amazing experience. And if you are interested in doing a virtual conference, a virtual meeting, a virtual meetup, whatever it happens to be, I and my team are going to be presenting a series of workshops that are not only designed to, come on in. You guys are all lined up against the back wall like I've got a machine gun and I'm ready to do something evil to you. So come on in. So just, we have a bunch of workshops that are going to be coming up on how to present virtual events and things like that. And we have many people who expressed a great deal of interest in learning how to help host events and produce your own events, as well as moderate and manage the video and things like that. So we're setting up a series of workshops coming up pretty soon that's going to be looking at all of that. And if you're interested in being a part of that, please let us know. We'd love to have you help with that as well as show up. Now, a couple more quick announcements because I want to get to Alan and give him as much time as we possibly can here. But we have a lot of things going on. First thing that's going on is please check our website. We do have news not only on how we did the conference, but also on the impact on the environment for doing the conference. And if you're trying to convince anyone that virtual meetups and things are the way to go, check out that article. It was stunning to see what we had. A geoscientist figured out what the calculation was of how much CO2 was not being put into the environment for doing that conference. So check that out. We also am going to be having some announcements that we are, Educators in VR, are partnering up with Earth Day 2020 here in AltSpace. And the goal is to build a series of worlds that are educational in nature that are Earth Day, celebrating Earth Day. And we need people who want to build worlds. We're also to be part of that network of worlds. And I'll be posting information about that on our website really shortly. It's in our Discord already. Please, if you have not joined our Discord channel, that's where most of the action's happening. It's right over by Alan is the link. Check that out. Make sure that you're you're involved in that. And then, so if one of the projects that we want to do as part of Earth Day is to have students working together, classes and students and teachers all working together to build worlds dedicated to Earth Day themes. And we have got some amazing themes that are lined up by the Earth Day team that you can do, or you can suggest one of your own. So do check that out. We're also working on a Students in VR conference that just got out of a meeting about that. It's going to be student produced and student led, and it's going to be happening hopefully the first week of May. We're going to move on this really quickly. And it's 2 days, and it's going to be freaking amazing. So make sure we'll have that news coming out. If you have a class that you're already working with VR that is, kind of high school through college level, and you'd like to have your students be involved, please contact me on Discord or whatever, or through our website at educatorsinvr.com. Time me, find me and virtually hold me down and let's talk. Also talk to the VR lady about it, and Donna McTee as well, because this is, and Karen, I'm sure that Karen is another good one to just funnel through her, and Diamond, if you see them, so they're part of our great team here. And I know there's more, but that's next week is Michael Zhang is going to be redoing his awesome presentation on relationships and community in social VR. So, I can't wait. That's going to be, so Alan Chao I just adore him. He's over there, is going to be presenting hello. Hey, yep, you're going to have to turn around and teleport back up. Hi, Michael. There you go. You're up against the wall. There you go. All right. So he's going to be, if you haven't visited any of the worlds that Alan has built here in AltSpace, you are missing out on some of the most spectacular, thoughtful worlds. And he's going to be talking about much of that. And I'm so proud that he is coming back to redo his presentation here on world building, user behavior, and user experience. This is really critical. When you build a world in VR, it is the same and yet different from building one in the real world. And he's been studying for over a year here on user behavior, and he's one of our top experts. I could say 1,000 things more, but you can find that on our events page. So Alan, it's all yours. Come on over here.
All right,
Get
cool.
up here. You're going to have to come over to where I am.
Oh, there we go.
And then walk around. There you go. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. And dazzle us, my friend.
Alrighty, cool. Thanks everyone for coming today. This is, like Rel mentioned, I originally gave this talk during the summit. This is kind of an encore presentation. Sorry if you hear dog noises in the background because my dog is in the room. Anyways, so just quickly, my name is Alan Chao, and my background is really working in interaction design and UX. And I've worked at 3D Tech. I worked in 3D Tech before and at startups. But I'm also a world creator or a world builder in AltSpace. And I've been, like Rel said, I've been building worlds in here for over a year, and actually approaching a year and a half, actually. Given my background in interaction design and UX, I've been, I really look at world building from a user perspective, and each world that I build really teaches me a new lesson about like a spatial design, and kind of, this is all new to everybody. So it's really teaching me a lot about, user behavior in virtual environments, specifically in social VR, but also it applies to any kind of multiplayer game as well. So this is kind of a a version of a series of articles I'm writing. The first part of it is on Medium Ready, calling it "Don't Get Stuck in the Hot Tub: Observing User Behavior in Virtual Environments." If you Google it, you can find part 1 ready on Medium, and what I'm covering today is kind of parts 2 and 3, and as well as some other things that I'm working on right now, which you'll probably see coming up pretty soon. So I'm actually relatively new to VR. My first headset was just an Oculus Go that I bought in 2018. And I only bought it honestly because it was on sale for Black Friday, and I was like, oh, let me try this VR thing. My friend James VR for years, and it wasn't until then that I was like, okay, fine, I'll try it. In some ways, I'm kind of a little bit stubborn when it comes to these technology. When it comes to emerging technologies, because I get interested in it when it becomes more accessible. In the beginning, it's full of engineers and technical people trying to figure out and streamline the technology part and the software part, just getting things stable. But as soon as we have a platform like AltSpace, and I can come in on a pretty accessible device and start creating things, I think that's when it becomes interesting, because I'm interested in the human aspect of things. So despite the fact that I'm pretty new to VR, I actually make an argument that that I've been interested in mixed reality for probably over 10 years. In 2009, I bought a 3D printed object off of a website called shapeways.com, and I bought one of these. It's a sculpture called Tornado by Bathsheba Grossman, uh, and you should look her up. She's like an amazing artist and mathematician. But yeah, I bought one of these sculptures on Shapeways, and I remember, a few days later, receiving it in the mail and taking the bubble wrap off and kind of feeling it in my hands and kind of like feeling the spikes against my fingers. And it was really that moment when it's like everyone has this moment where when you hold something for the first time that's 3D printed, it kind of feels like magic because just a few days ago it was just an idea. Maybe it never even existed before. Um, and through 3D printing, I can now actually hold it in my hands. Um, and fast forward to a few years, actually about 3 years later, I actually started working for Shapeways, kind of incidentally. Um, 3D printing has always been a hobby of mine, so it was kind of like a natural kind of thing for me. And again and again, I saw people build 3D objects for the first time or experience their own 3D models being printed and actually getting to see what they created. And again, it is magical to people, which is pretty cool. And so I was kind of thinking like, well, maybe 3D printing is actually in some way a form of mixed reality, because if you have a model of a bone, let's say, and you 3D print it, it's still, it's still just an idea of a bone represented in plastic. Like it was never alive, and it's most likely not made out of calcium, but nonetheless, we feel like it is real in some shape or form, and holding it in our hands actually lets us experience it in a way that is spatial and very intuitive to us. And I think that's actually exactly what VR does as well. So yeah, that's kind of my argument for why I've actually been interested in XR for a while. Um, but going back to my first headset, I probably discovered AltSpace a few weeks into getting my first headset, and it wasn't too long before I realized that hey, like what I was doing with 3D printing, I can actually do with AltSpace. I very quickly discovered world building, and at the time, we didn't have the Unity uploader like we do now, and things were based off of like A-frame and stuff. And I started diving into that. I created a few very simple worlds in the beginning. Okay. So the first world I actually built was actually just really simple Starbucks that I made in SketchUp. You can see it's not really well done, but someone had actually made a KFC just using the world editor in AltSpace, and I just thought it was hilarious to have such a mundane kind of space in AltSpace. Kind of like on a cutting edge social VR platform, we have a KFC built with primitive objects in AltSpace. But people really enjoyed it, and I thought I got a kick out of it. So I thought let's try Starbucks, like an equally well known kind of franchise. But yeah, as soon as I brought people into the space, they started role playing immediately. What's kind of interesting is like, I thought about the essence of what Starbucks is. I have the cash registers, that bar that people walk up to, pastry case with, cake pops and other pastries and stuff, and a few props in the back, like the toaster ovens and stuff. And I even painstakingly put in the condiment bar with, 4 different types of sugar. And people actually noticed that. But anyways, as soon as I brought people in, people started role playing. People ran behind the counter, and they started taking people's orders, and then people started lining up and started making really ridiculous drink orders and stuff. And there were like little mock fights about like, oh, my drink isn't right, like why didn't you get that right? But yeah, it was just kind of funny to watch. And somehow in the process, I was named the store manager as well, so that's cool. So I tend to go in one direction and then go in the total opposite direction. The next world I created, I call Cube Space, and it is nothing but basically a black void with probably 20,000-ish cubes, and also an ambient track kind of looping in the background. But that's it. So when people entered this world, it was interesting. Some people got a little bit confused. They didn't really do anything. They're just like, oh, what is this? And then they just left. But some people actually stayed around. They kind of walked through this matrix of cubes, and if you turn on fly, it can fly around the space, and you can see like the pattern kind of is constantly changing as you move. So it's kind of a cool experience for people. But what was really interesting is when maybe like half a dozen or so people came into the space, because suddenly, you have people asking each other like, oh, like, what is this? Like, what do you think this is? And, they actually started to create kind of their own mythologies. We must follow the way of the cube. And, people were even trying to rationalize like what this was, or trying to figure out, what this potentially could be. But they were using their imagination, which I thought was pretty cool. And this actually reminds me of a concept that Isamu Noguchi came up with, called non-directive play. And Noguchi is a well-known modern artist. He's a sculptor. He's a Japanese-American sculptor. And I guess some of his lesser known work is things like this. This is an architectural scale model, essentially, in sculpture form, I guess, of one of his projects called Play Mountain. I believe it was a series, and I believe this is actually just one of them. But this is a series of playgrounds for children, which, instead of your typical jungle gym or swing set that where like, you know how to use it, this was actually designed for the landscape itself. So I don't know if you can see it, but kind of towards the top left of that, those little ridges are actually like steps. So that just kind of gives you a sense of scale. It was actually like a pretty, it's just like essentially a park. And the whole thing acted as like an abstract playground. And the idea is like instead of telling someone how to use a space, let them use their imagination and actually create their own story behind the space. And I guess let kids use their imagination, I think, is kind of the moral of that story. But yeah, if you kind of compare the two, it's interesting. One is very literal and one is very abstract. With the Starbucks, you're actually loading a whole set of expectations and basically instructions for behavior just by slapping that Starbucks name on it. And you just need to, again, it wasn't a very detailed model. It's very badly done, actually, technically speaking. But it was enough for people to actually, I put in the key elements so that people understood how to actually behave in that space. And sure enough, they did. And with Keep Space, all I really did was I created a setting, I created a feeling in the space, and really it was just kind of setting the stage for interpretation and for people to use their imagination. Alrighty, so yeah, a little over a year ago, I was living in upstate New York. And I'm actually in upstate New York right now, but at the time, I normally live in New York City, and I was taking a little bit of a break and spending a few months upstate, in New York City. It's in quietness and calmness, and it's a good thing now with the coronavirus. But what's kind of nice about New York City is really like the ever-present buzz and energy that you get from being there. And it's never quite quiet, even in the middle of the night. And there's just like a kind of grunginess that comes with being in the city that I was kind of almost feeling homesick about, or yeah, there's just something about it that, about the grunginess of New York that I found pretty beautiful, I guess. And, New York isn't perfect, and it isn't pristine, and but I think New York kind of represents the good and the bad at the same time. So with that thought, I really want to create a space, an alt space, with that kind of communicated some of those feelings, I guess. So I came up with a space I called Brooklyn Rooftop. Although I don't live in, I think I chose Brooklyn just because it's a little bit more well known than Queens. It's a little bit more hipstery than Queens as well. And I did want to actually create a hipstery kind of roof garden space. And of course, you have like a soundtrack of actual sound recorded in New York. And it's a nighttime scene. It's a little bit dark. And it's really meant to communicate a lot of the feelings I felt in New York. It is grungy. There are these scary steps that lead you to street level. I never thought it was scary until it's like, someone came into the, looked at the stairs and was like, yeah, I think I'm gonna get mugged here. But my thought was like, well, that's how New York is. So it is the good and the bad, I guess, but I do find that including that part in the space gives you a sense of place. It's not just a space. I'm trying not to rhyme that much, but that's just how it is. Um, yeah, so I wanted to create a space where I relied a lot on lighting actually as an element that I use because I think if you think about it, you can have something low poly, but if you light it properly, lighting is actually somewhat realistic, and we can get away with that in AltSpace. So yeah, anyways, that's a whole other talk about realism. Um, but yeah, I want to create a space that appealed to adults. So of course, that's why it's a bar. Um, and yeah, like kind of like a Starbucks, when you have a setting like a bar, you are telling people about like you're informing people of how to use the space. So in this case, you're supposed to hang out. Uh, the other thing about the Starbucks is you have that role play element. So sure enough, with this bar, you have people actually going behind the bar and saying like, hey, like what do you like? What can I get for you? And people actually trying to order drinks, and it's actually you get the same kind of role playing kind of thing, which is kind of fun. And that's also an element of people staying in the space and feeling like there's something to do, essentially. Um, so I think my main takeaway with the Brooklyn rooftop was really that it came from this very honest place in my own mind, honest if you will, or very genuine rather. It was a feeling that I wanted to convey through spatial design. And I think, hearing people actually come into the space and talk about it, I think I think people actually get it because it was around the time where I actually when I first finished the space where it was like 2 a.m. and I couldn't really fall asleep. So of course, happened I hop onto AltSpace, and there was someone actually there was like a group of people in the hot tub. All of them were basically adults, and people were actually drinking beers in real life or whatever other drink, and just chatting with each other. And one of the people said like, real world vibes in a virtual one. And I felt like this quote kind of stuck with me for throughout the year, throughout the year or more that I've been building worlds, and has kind of become a mantra for me as well. Because, everything, it's not a high poly space. It's nothing too realistic, but I think they felt the feeling I wanted to convey. And because of that, it was believable in that sense. And they understood, the purpose of the space essentially. So yeah, that's that space. Um, so the next space that I created, actually, this isn't necessarily chronological, but the next space that I'm talking about is my Zen garden space. Um, Sorry, I'm fussing with my digital slides. Um, so this is a photograph that I took in 2006. This is actually my grandfather's Japanese garden in Taiwan, and I took it in 2006. It was about a year after my grandfather actually passed away that my mom and I went to Taiwan to visit my grandmother, who her health was also not great at the time. But during the stay, well, actually taking a step back, something that happens with a lot of children of immigrants is you might not know a lot. You might not be extremely close to a lot of your relatives. I know for me, at basically 8,000 miles separating, my family here in New York and a lot of my relatives and grandparents. So I honestly never really felt super close to my grandparents. They only visited us a couple of times, throughout their lives. Um, but during this trip, I actually felt like, I got to I got to know my grandfather a lot better, basically post mortem. So I was actually staying in his apartment. My mom and I stayed in his apartment. So like suddenly I was surrounded by all these belongings that he had, and no one had really bothered to like collect anything. Everything was basically essentially how he left it. So I remember sitting at his desk and just seeing a little cup of pencils and pens and like calligraphy brushes and like his thick black glasses that he had still sitting there. And I just felt like I was getting to almost know him, uh, you know, basically after he had passed away. And the other factor there is actually the roof garden. So he actually had he had a roof garden that he created because throughout his life he had worked in agriculture, and about one third of it was a Japanese garden, and the rest of it was a vegetable garden. Um, but it kind of occurred to me that he had created this space because he had created this space for his family and for his close friends, and in some ways it actually outlived him. And I was remembering it years after I actually visited, and many years after he passed away, and it still had an impact to me for me. So I want to really communicate that. I want to kind of hold on to that feeling and kind of communicate it in the form of a world in alt space. So to kind of pay homage to, I guess, my grandfather and also my Taiwanese heritage, I created my own Zen garden. This is a picture of it in alt space, and it's focused around basically a little tea house and a little garden. So the garden is pretty. It's not meant to look like my grandfather's garden, but it's definitely representative of how I remember it. Um, and the tea house is there because my family has actually been there's tea farm land essentially in my family, and we've been growing oolong tea for probably over 20 years now. Actually almost 30 years. So tea was always kind of in. We always had that tea in the house, and there's a way that you're supposed to drink it and stuff like that. So I guess tea culture has been kind of in my family. But just little details like thinking about the tatami mats that are used in a lot of these little tea house setups. Even in Taiwan today, you have a lot of areas where like in architecture in houses, people still use tatami mats in Taiwan. And I should have said this earlier, but Taiwan is technically a Republic of China, although it operates as its own country. But the reason why there's Japanese influence is because the Japanese occupied Taiwan for about 50 years, up until 1949. So, like my grandparents, when they were younger, grew up essentially thinking that they're Japanese citizens. My grandmother actually didn't even speak Mandarin, which she associated with, being Chinese. She didn't even speak Mandarin until she was an adult. They spoke Taiwanese and Japanese at home. Um, Anyways, I should have said that earlier. But um, but yeah, just like these little details, like feeling the tatami mats like on my feet, like as I'm sitting there, or the smell of the hay or the grass that's used to weave the mats. I want to really communicate that in the space. Um, and I also say that it's kind of a memory size space. I only have a few little, you know, visuals in my head of what the space looks like, and it's mostly a feeling. So it is actually a very, very small space, which ended up being kind of interesting in terms of learning about like personal space. Because when you spawn in, this is what you see. You see just you're spawned in the tea house, and you basically just see the tea house, and you see a little bit of the garden. But if you go out in the garden, it's really just a really, really small space. It's like a little path that loops around, and you have a koi pond. And the koi pond is actually kind of acts like a hot tub. It's not literally a hot tub, but like people like to be inside in the ground for some reason. So um, people always like to gravitate towards things like pools and stuff. So I made the koi pond while I was building. The koi pond got just deeper and deeper until you could actually just submerge yourself in it. Um, but yeah, I found that people, because it is a very relaxing, almost intimate kind of space, I find that people tend to go into that space and start opening up to about their lives, right? I found myself being there with just like two or three close friends, and we would start to talk about really close, intimate topics, like personal topics about our lives. Um, and I start to observe this very strange behavior when people would start coming in and then they would just like instantly leave. And I'd have no idea why, but I'd just see someone spawn in. Because up, you can kind of see the hot tub in there, the hot tub, the koi pond. But you can actually, yeah, I saw people spawn in and then they would just vanish, and I had no idea why. Until one day, I decided to come into this space, and then there were already two people sitting in the koi pond talking, and I don't remember specifically what it was, but it was a really personal conversation. And then I actually kind of panicked. I was like, oh shit, I shouldn't be hearing this. So I immediately kind of ducked to the right and then just hit the home button to get out there because it felt like I was intruding on someone's personal conversation. And even, it was even before I actually exited, one person was like, was someone just here? I kind of swear I just saw somebody. But that was exactly the experience that I had of other people coming into the space and vanishing. I really learned that, like, in particular, in some kind of settings, both in terms of size and also, a kind of space that communicates a certain type of feeling, it can really set the stage for what you talk about, and yeah, it can really actually just be, it can feel really, really personal as well. There have also been times where I've had maybe even just 8 people in here, and it felt completely full. It felt overcrowded with like about 8 people. So that was just like on a very technical, not technical, but like on a size kind of thinking about size. That's a number that I just thought about. I'm like, okay, so like given this kind of area, the limit is maybe 6 to 8 people. Uh, yeah, that was just a little tidbit. So going from calm to complete chaos, the next world I'm talking about is Meme Island. So it was around the holiday seasons, both in 2018 and 19, that we saw, AltSpace always sees like a huge influx of users during the holiday season, and it's probably going to be like that for every holiday season going forward. But of course, when as VR becomes more accessible, it means that we have a wider range of users, including a lot of young users. So it was interesting for me to see kind of the reaction from the community. A lot of the existing, a lot of the existing users in AltSpace. It was actually somewhat negative. People kind of saw it as an intrusion of space in many ways. People were asking for age-restricted spaces, and there was an element of there was a valid argument there because with some events there were some moderation issues as well. But this kind of got me thinking on a much higher level about VR in general. Like, my thought was like, okay, we're in VR, we have infinite space. So why is it that people feel like there's an intrusion of space in VR? Is VR not big enough for all of us to coexist? So that was just kind of on my mind for a period of time. And it wasn't until one night that I was at my rooftop bar space, the Brooklyn rooftop space, that there are a few kids at the bar. They're clearly kids, and they're like, "Oh, can I get a Sprite cranberry?" Um, and this is a meme, by the way. So it wasn't until then that I realized that, like, hey, like, okay, this makes sense. There just aren't that many kid-friendly spaces in AltSpace right now. And there are definitely some teenagers who are building worlds, but most of them aren't really, they're not necessarily opening up Unity, at least at the time, and building worlds. So I was thinking, okay, so that's a simple thing to solve for. What kind of space can I create for the kids, to so that they can kind of have their own space without, quote unquote, bothering the adults. So I actually worked with a builder at the time, Dimmies. He's not as active in AltSpace anymore, but you can find him on the internet. But yeah, I partnered with Dimmies to work on this low poly style world called Meme Island, and it's themed after like a summer camp, which we thought was kind of appropriate for a younger audience. We somehow got like a zip line that kind of worked, which was kind of fun. So you could kind of teleport up to the hill in the background or the mountain, and zip line down all the way to the water. And at the time, it was actually like no one had. I mean, Allspray doesn't have like easy ways for transporting people, but this was a really one of the first ways that we kind of got around that, and we had a lot of fun with it. Um, we had a screen in there, a video player, that people could they could watch their Pavlov gameplay. People who just want to that was another major complaint with some Hangout spaces, because you'd be listening to your to your 80s playlist, and then suddenly you just have Pavlov. Um, you can enjoy a balanced school lunch of burnt chicken nuggets and Tide Pods. Don't eat Tide Pods. And most importantly, we actually had a code of conduct in here. And thinking a little bit about Starbucks, I'm going to refer to that a lot, but using the idea of a pre-existing idea as a way of informing behavior, part of the reason why we chose a summer camp is because you have this hierarchy, right? Kids are always looking for the authority figure in a space. In real life, it might be like the oldest one in their group, or maybe the teacher in the classroom, or the parent, or something. Or in VR, it's like, who's the moderator? Are you the moderator? They're always looking for the owner of the world or the moderator in AltsSpace. So, we decided to create a code of conduct so that things wouldn't get too chaotic, because obviously that was a big concern when you put a bunch of teenagers on the internet in one space and have just a video player, a YouTube player there. So we had a code of conduct that essentially just reiterated the AltSpace community guidelines. But it was also an incentive for people who visit the space to become moderators of the space. So if they abide by the rules and also encourage others to abide by the rules, and we see that they hang out in the space a lot and we kind of gain their trust, then they get the privilege of being a moderator for Meme Island, which gives them the ability to kick users who are misbehaving. And we also give them flight, the ability to fly into space. And we had one watchtower, but that was only accessible if you had a flying. So, but yeah, these are all concepts that are very familiar to teenagers or kids in general. Basically following rules, looking for authority figures, and but yeah, this is sure enough like people actually we're always asking like, oh, can I be a moderator? So it was actually working. Unfortunately, a lot of this world got a little bit messed up in the 2019 Unity update, but yeah, I think AltSpace is also much different now. It's much more different now. Like we have a lot more spaces, so that's good. But yeah, things actually seem to work pretty well in this space. Alrighty. So moving on. So after being in AltSpace for quite some time, I was thinking about specifically about events and how to push the boundaries of events. To be really, frank with you, I think the format of using, a slide deck and just me standing here in the audience, it's amazing that we can do this in AltSpace and in VR and that it works as well as it does, right? But honestly, if you think about the scope of VR, it is pretty boring. And there's so many possibilities, and I think this is just scratching the surface. So another thing that I really wanted to focus on was education. I have a learning disability. Growing up, I had an IEP in school, and I was always the kid who struggled at academics, except for science. Science in most cases, not chemistry, but in science in most cases was kind of the subject I was actually good at. But everything else I was not really great at. And really learning through abstraction, like the extraction of information, was really always a challenge for me. And unfortunately, that's kind of the status quo of learning these days. But for me, I always had these side projects and other things I was working on even as a kid. So I think my mom, luckily, she never really pushed me that hard when it came to academics. But yeah, I think conceptual learning was always what I was better at, and yeah, I just thought that there are a lot of possibilities in VR. So something that Tom Furness actually mentioned during the summit, during one of his talks, he mentioned that VR unlocks spatial memory, and I thought that was like a brilliant way of putting it. Because it creates a sense of place in your mind, and it's really those spatial memories that stick and make you better comprehend the complexity of a certain subject, and it also makes you remember those things better. So I thought, okay, so what's something that I can teach? And I thought, well, beekeeping. I'm not by any means like a professional. I was just a hobbyist for a period of time. I don't even keep bees now, unfortunately, but I started keeping bees in around 2015 or so, and I kept bees for a few years. But after kind of starting beekeeping, I had these conversations with friends, and as soon as I brought up bees, like there was just like an onslaught of one question after another about bees. Like, oh, is it true that there's only one queen in each beehive, and what do bees do in the winter, and like how much honey do you get, and all these questions. And soon enough, I would have these like 2-hour conversations about bees, which I actually loved. It was tiring, but I actually loved talking about bees because as a beekeeper, you have to know so much about bees, and uh, and yeah, like when it comes to honeybees, people just are not very informed. That's one subject that I found that like nobody really knows about. Like this, your smartest friend does not really know about honeybees. So I thought it would be great to actually create a world that focused around teaching about bees, and that's where I came up with my event that I named Ask a Beekeeper, and I modeled a space. I want to model a space after my own bee yard, and this is a picture of my bee yard. The first year I started, I just started with 3 hives, and this is in upstate New York, and um, and yeah, I've only been able to maybe bring like half a dozen or so people to my bee yard just because first of all, there's only so many people who are willing to willfully surround themselves with, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of stinging insects. But also, you need to physically be there. I only had one extra, bee suit instead of equipment. Um, Long story short, it's a high barrier to entry. So I want to create a space, and I just accidentally triggered Siri. But anyways, anyway, you love technology. I'm going to silent my phone now. Thank you, technology, for interrupting my talk. Okay, that was interesting. Okay, so I really wanted to spend the time to recreate that experience of being at my bee yard with people. At the same time, kind of teaching people about bees as well. So I had one simple rule for myself, which is that I didn't want to have slides or any kind of 3D representation, or rather any kind of 2D representation of anything in this presentation. So what that ended up meaning was that I had to actually 3D model all the assets myself. Um, in conversation with friends, I was always I was always like gesturing with my hands, like, oh, so imagine you have like a box, and in every box you have 10 frames, and or like imagine a frame like on the outer edge, blah blah blah. So instead of doing that, I was thinking with VR I can bring in 3D objects, so I may as well try to utilize that fact and actually create all these assets that I needed in VR and actually be able to just to point at it. I think that was really powerful. So just another tip before I forget, I actually used my own beekeeping equipment as a part of the process too. So I actually photographed each side of the boxes and used them as the textures. So the interesting effect was that all the equipment actually ended up looking very personal, and it looked just like my bee yard because it was quite literally using assets from my own bee yard. So I even used my drone to take a 360 photograph of the property above the property above my bee yard. And yeah, so this is like kind of what I ended up with. I had just a really basic setup here, a short video just to kind of show you. But yeah, I spent a lot of time even just creating like different particle systems to make sure that the bees felt kind of real to experience, and kind of the controlled chaos, the sense of controlled chaos on a bee yard. But throughout the event, I was able to just answer I basically I have an outline that I go through, and that's really just to kind of spark conversation. I have my questions panel open at all times, and I just have people, raise their hand, and I'll just kind of answer the question. And it's usually a pretty natural progression as well. Like the questions very much align with what I'm talking about, and like on the fly, I can manipulate these objects and essentially create these exploded views of the beehive on the fly as I'm talking and answering questions. Um, and yeah, the other So the other important thing here is that I found that like because people people were actually, they felt the sense of presence. They felt like they could actually see things in real life. And actually, when it comes to something like beekeeping, it can seem very abstract, right? But when you can see something right in front of you, I think the questions I got were a lot more specific than the questions that I got just from casual conversation. And I was actually pretty impressed sometimes. Like, sometimes I even got stumped because I never really thought about it. So it was interesting. And I think that kind of goes back to people being able to complexity on a whole different level in a virtual space, and and as if they were actually in front of uh, uh, you know, the subject matter experience. So kind of keeping on the subject of VR, not VR, of teaching and education. So my sister is actually a DOE teacher. She teaches middle school special education, and we've had a lot of conversations about different learning styles because she was kind of the opposite of me. Like she did well academically, and school was a very different experience for her. It was not a struggle like it was for me. But at the same time, it's like we have these two very contracting experiences. So we talk a lot about how people how I kind of learn things differently, and versus the way that she teaches. And she kind of asked me like, well, what do you think would help you in this case? Since her students, she's every day she's trying to figure out different ways of presenting things to her students, and she knows my interest in VR. So we were thinking like it would be interesting to actually think about VR in the context of figure out what the role of VR can be in like 2 days standard lesson. And you probably think about the cell, like the lesson about the animal cell and plant cells, as kind of like it's almost like, well, obviously. But even though it seems obvious, I felt like it was actually a good exercise to kind of see how that goes, because she sent me a few of her lesson plans and slides and stuff, and I was seeing pictures like this, and I'm like, this is like the same stuff that I saw like 18 years ago, when I was learning about this stuff. It's instead of a blurry photocopy, we have a blurry JPEG. So what's kind of interesting here is like you tell students that like this squiggly line is different from this squiggly line, and that's different from this squiggly line. And you look at this and you're like, okay, well, there's not much of a difference. And so because of that, I'm not really surprised that like there are students that actually don't understand this content, because this is just so abstract from not only what it is, but like the potential of actually explaining it. So yeah, point being, I think those little 2D diagrams are kind of sad. They're not really doing much in terms of helping people understand the difference between different organelles. So I kind of set out to make my own diagram of an animal cell, and I understand that these are all diagrams. Like if you actually look for a photo of a cell under the microscope, it kind of just looks like a grainy blob with like other grainy blobs inside. But it was interesting. What was interesting to me is that through the process of using Oculus Medium to actually sculpt my own model of the cell or diagram of the cell, I found that there are very few accurate representation, or not even accurate, but there are very few three-dimensional representations of the cell. Even the 3D models that I found online were like cross sections, because you always see a cross section of a cell. So that, in some ways, a cell is so abstract that you can't even really find that much information about a cell in visual form on the internet. And I ended up watching like college, basically college level classes on like organelle function in order to even understand that, like, okay, so for a lysosome, there should probably be a blob with little things in it or something, because like if you think about the 2D representation, it's like this circle and that circle, but when you think about it three-dimensionally, it doesn't really work that way. So anyways, that's kind of a rant, but point being, it took a lot to actually represent something like a cell in artistic form in 3 dimensions. But this is kind of what I ended up with. I had something, again, instead of a little diagram or a little even model that you have in front of you, I want to blow it up and make it huge. So that little line that you see is actually an avatar, and the idea is that it's like you're entering this huge world, right? It's like you're a tiny little thing, and you're going into the cell. You can actually fly through the cell membrane and kind of look at the shape of it and notice that the little entrances, and you can pretend you can teleport onto the Golgi body, or fly into the nucleus of the cell. And I just felt like not only is it very clear, or it could be a lot clearer what one organelle is versus another, but even in the context of a class, let's say a class came into this, um, you know, when you add the social element, it can be kind of interesting, because it's like, oh yeah, remember when Robert teleported onto the Golgi body, or it's like it just presents a lot of interesting opportunities for learning that I think you just don't get in other ways. It also creates and again, because it's a sense of place, I think things will stick a lot better in people's minds. So, again, this is just a prototype. This is almost a thought experiment, because I never actually had a class go into this. Although I guess this is in some ways an open call. If you have access to VR in your class and you happen to be learning about the cell, you should definitely get in contact. But this was an interesting experience, and it was definitely a lot of work. But it was I think it forced me to kind of think about that process of how VR would actually play into an actual everyday middle school science lesson. And let me see, do I have any other notes about that? All right. So okay, so this is most of what I have in terms of what I'm covering in parts 1 to 3 of my series of articles. But I have a few other things. Oh, this is just another shot. So I do have a few other things to talk about, just some upcoming work. So I have some current projects I'm currently working on, as well as some other things I want to explore in AltSpace and in VR in general. So I actually I create, if not most, if not all of the spaces used for Evolver in AltSpace. And Evolver is a spiritual community. They hold meditation events in AltSpace every day, as well as various work kind of conversational events about spirituality and stuff like that. But this is one of the first. This is the first world that I built for them. It's kind of like this ancient ruins, like kind of in the forest, in this kind of foggy forest. I also created a version of my Zen garden specifically for the event, and you can see this is the reason why I didn't use the original space was, again, it was so small that it was not meant for an event. But I opened it up, and instead of a koi pond, I have this little stream, and this is almost like it's almost like it's kind of on an island. It's very open, but it has the same feeling. Something that is coming up, I'm creating a Tibetan temple for Evolver. Actually, I've been to the Tibetan Plateau, actually, and also Nepal, and so I actually modeled everything in here, and it's a lot of work, but again, it's all about creating that feeling. As well as this is kind of a very experimental kind of space-themed meditation space as well. That's also coming up. You'll probably see these in the next couple of weeks. The other thing I want to experiment with is social dynamics. So I'm actually one of the organizers of the LGBTQ meetup in AltSpace. It's on Wednesdays, and I just find it interesting how as you can imagine, these events are kind of a magnet for trolls, right? And it's interesting how there's like a very predictable pattern in terms of trolling when it comes to these events. So I wanted to see if I could, essentially make a space where that social dynamic is reversed. So, as anyone, whether you're a part of the LGBTQ community, or whether you're a person of color, or any other kind of minority group, you probably know that like you know what it's like to feel a little bit different in a space, right? In the majority of spaces that we walk through every day are you do feel a little bit different. So I wanted to create a space where it was very clear, the values of the space, and like when you enter the space, you actually see you see the different pride flags, and it is very clear that this is an LGBTQ friendly space, and but yeah, I have a wall where there's actually you have photographs of some people who are involved in LGBTQ activism in the past. Um, but point being, what I want to do with this space, and it's more than just the space itself and what's on the walls and the flags and everything, but I do want to experiment with other methods of basically changing the social dynamic, making it really clear quote unquote owns the space, so that I think when it comes to trolls, they think that any space is safe for them to troll, but I wanted to almost turn that dynamic around and make it a not safe space for trolls, and instead making it giving the power to people in the community. So I'll be experimenting with MREs probably in the coming future. That's the Windows Mixed Reality extension, our way of bringing logic into alt space, like apps. But yeah, this is an ongoing experiment that is definitely something that I'm passionate about. So with that, I just want to leave. I'll end my presentation with kind of 3 tips for world building. I see I have 4 minutes left. So first
We
is
want to
start with
make time for some questions.
yeah. This is the last part.
We're running out of time. Okay.
Yeah, it's the last part. So start with the feeling. So make sure I think it's important to articulate what you want to communicate in the world and what you want people to feel. I think for me as a creator, I think ultimately if I can make someone feel something, I think that is then I'm successful. It's a part of telling the story. Secondly, create a place, not only just a space. So the reason why you want people to feel something is because, like I mentioned, I think experience is kind of the truest form of storytelling in a way, and designing a space that has a backstory is important because it's basically non-linear storytelling in some ways. So the space can inform what people think and how people behave. It creates it sets rules for behavior and such. And lastly, this is kind of just a basic thing when it comes to designing in general, but make sure to design for a problem. Whether it's a meditation space or a hangout space or whatever the case is, make sure you understand the use case. I think that's pretty important as well. But yeah, I think that's actually it. Just quick shout out. I also do the XR industry meetup every other week. I think this is the next one. And that's my information. I'm ACD on Twitter. And
all right, give it up for Alan. That is beautiful. Thank you. Wow. I love it. Take that in, my friend. You do amazing work.
Yay.
Yay, I love it. I love it.